All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of the week again. We're here to do the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman and joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are you today, Steve?
I'm doing all right. We're filming this out of order, so this is actually the last part of the podcast, but I'm filming it before I film the main interview. So it's like a time warp thing going on.
Sure.
In fact, I might have a haircut. I don't know. We'll see if I have time to do that. That'll be fun.
Complete outfit change.
Yeah, it'll be like a movie where they denote the time change by having the characters change their hair and outfits. But yeah, we'll see. I'm doing good though. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, can't complain. Got some big news in the gun world this week. Obviously, there was a very tragic mass shooting over the holiday weekend in Highland Park. Which, of course, as a lot of these shootings tend to do, sort of reignited the discussion of gun politics again. Mm-hmm. And the timing of that is very interesting just because we're coming off of a big federal gun control legislation, the first in many, many years. And it's already reignited new conversations. And we have a story from Eric Eva, one of our interns here, if you want to dive into a little bit more of the details there.
Yeah, so the story is basically just the Democratic reaction to the July 4th shooting. Which is along the lines of what you might expect. You know, they basically say that the bipartisan gun bill was a good start, but clearly insufficient in the face of this new shooting, which is essentially what a lot of gun rights folks had predicted would be the case. And to be fair to Democrats, they all along, many of them were saying that this wasn't the end goal for them. It doesn't have most of their top priorities in it, like an assault weapons ban or magazine bans or universal background checks or policies of that nature. It obviously focused more on, funding for red flag laws, which Illinois already has one, but that wasn't used in this case. Again, there's sort of another unfortunate failure because there were a lot of red flags in this case, just like in Buffalo, but it wasn't something that people followed up on, unfortunately. And it sort of seems like the family went the opposite direction and helped this person obtain firearms after they had made a series of threats. But regardless, the bill focused on trying to prevent people who have domestic violence history towards their dating partners or who have a juvenile criminal record from getting guns. So there's a different approach than what most Democrats want. And so all along they were saying this was sort of the first step. And now the next significant mass shooting that we've seen, they're now calling for more gun control, of course. So for instance, the president himself, President Joe Biden, said, "I recently signed the first major bipartisan gun reform legislation in almost 30 years into law, which includes actions that will save lives. But there's much more work to do, and I'm not going to give up fighting the epidemic of gun violence." Tammy Duckworth said, last month Congress approved that bipartisan gun compromises on gun safety are possible. Today proved that we can't stop there. Senator Murphy, who is one of the key negotiators in the bipartisan gun deal, he said, "We have broken the back of the gun lobby. We now have made possible changes in our gun laws that can keep our communities safer. Today is a reminder that we still have a long road to travel." So, he called it just the beginning. And obviously that's in line with what a lot of the critiques from gun rights advocates were at the time, which is that as soon as there's another shooting, there would just be calls for new legislation. And so that's what we're seeing. But whether that actually materializes into new legislation is another question, of course.
Right.
So we haven't seen that yet. Most of these calls are for assault weapons bans.
Right.
So that seems very unlikely.
I was going to say, I think the odds of that are slim to none because we're getting ever closer to what's shaping up to be a pretty contentious midterms, especially one where they predict to be a fairly sizable red wave because it is, an off year with a Democrat in the White House. Mm-hmm. Plus some things in the economy are pointing to a potential big win for Republicans. It seems like an assault weapons ban. We've covered pretty recently here just the way the politics of assault weapons bans have been shaping up lately makes that already kind of unlikely.
Yeah.
But with those electoral factors, man, I don't know if I see a real big push after all the political capital that was spent just getting this last bipartisan bill across the finish line.
Yeah, and it gets to the point where I mean, that was always the question with the previous bill, the political calculation. Who's this for? Like, who's this benefiting in terms of the politics of it? Right. Because as soon as there's another mass shooting, it's just going to appear like a half measure to a lot of the people who want more gun control, right?
Sure.
And it's going to appear like a betrayal to the people who don't want more gun control. So, I guess the calculation was to try and hit that sort of middle zone of people who might generally favor stricter gun laws in some circumstances, but aren't really gun control activists necessarily, and they aren't gun rights activists either. So I guess the cool question is, like, if you keep having mass shootings like this, if it doesn't actually produce a noticeable decrease in either mass shootings or violent crime generally, gun crime generally, is that going to be a political winner for any of the people involved? I mean, certainly it's probably a bigger question for the Republicans who passed it, because they're the ones taking more of a political risk, I would imagine. The Democrats can say, as they're saying now, that, well, it's a start, it's something that we got done at least, but we want to do much more. Even if it doesn't seem to be any bill materializing right now. I've talked to several sources, Republican sources on the Hill, and they don't see appetite for a new gun bill at this point.
Right.
We're planning to do a follow-up piece on the Republicans' reactions. There haven't been a lot of public reactions, that, at least not in the type that talk about legislation, right? So it seems unlikely that you're going to get another bipartisan gun bill through before the midterms happen.
Yeah, particularly in the Senate.
Yeah, and especially because the things that would be in a new bill are going to be more controversial.
Absolutely.
Much more controversial, I would imagine. Like an assault weapons ban is far more controversial than what's in the current law that was just signed. As much as there's plenty of things in there that are controversial, an assault weapons ban or universal background checks those are the big ticket items. And
I think it is fair to. I think it's worth noting, and it's only fair to point out that this shooting took place in Illinois, where universal background checks are law of the land. There's an ID, a FOID purchasing permit law.
Yeah,
there's an assault weapons ban.
Firearm owner identification card, which is basically a permit to purchase guns.
Right. And there's an assault weapons ban in the town where this happened. There's a high capacity magazine ban in the town where this happened. And by all accounts that we've seen in reporting so far, he obtained this gun legally somehow. Mm-hmm. So it's just all these different, basically all the legislative items on the wish list that are being called for right now were already the law of the land in this shooting, I think, which just makes the political dynamics here all the more disfavorable to Democrats getting an actual bill, because Republicans can just say, look what happened here in Illinois. Your proposals didn't work. So
the only problem with that is you could have made the same argument about the bill that did pass, because none of the things in that bill would have had any effect on the Uvalde shooting.
Sure.
That it was responding to. Maybe it's vaguely related in some ways because of the age of the shooter, and some of these reforms targeted people by their age, but none of them, it appears, would have prevented him from buying a gun.
Sure.
And that's the other problem. Like, yeah, the red flag law failed in Illinois, and their FOID card system failed to stop this shooter from getting guns, but that's primarily because people didn't use those systems. Now, maybe the police should have done something. He had a 2019 incident where he had threatened to kill his family, and he had his knives confiscated, I guess. And then later on, his father co-signed on his FOID card for minors, or for anyone, not minors, anyone under 21. In Illinois, you have to have a co-signer for the period where you're under 21. But he didn't commit the shooting until he was 22.
Right.
So this was years later, and it's unclear outside of an actual conviction or involuntary commitment, which both are potentially could have happened. The police have been called for 2 different incidents from what's been reported. One was suicidal ideation, and so perhaps he could have been involuntarily committed over that, although that's obviously not a super common response to somebody having suicidal thoughts. So, I don't know how realistic that is. But then later, they were called back because he had threatened to kill his family, and obviously he was doing a lot of things in his social media presence, including he had a music career where he alluded to shootings and being killed by the police and school shootings. And so, there obviously are red flags in the history of the shooter, but again, with a lot of these shooters, including Uvalde, had red flags as well. I think there were reports about him threatening women and animal abuse, but these things are all potential disqualifiers if they're followed up on.
Right.
And oftentimes they're not. And that's where you get into the real problems. And it can be hard for a family, I'm sure, with somebody who's having mental health struggles to, take those necessary steps, because I'm sure they're hoping that there's a less severe path to solving the problem, right? So I don't want to underplay how difficult it is to actually stop these sorts of attacks in real life. A lot of this is hindsight being pretty clear when you pile up a lot of things over years. But that's one of the weaknesses of a red flag system or involuntary commitment, or even, a system based on convictions for prohibiting people from purchasing guns, because you might have an incident that in hindsight it's clear was a red flag and something that should have been done about it, but at the time might have, a lot of people are, the Buffalo shooter's another one where he was taken by police after making a threat while at school, and it wasn't necessarily a specific threat. It was a generalized threat of violence, and he was taken for a mental health evaluation and apparently was cleared, was not, and for whatever reason that didn't, they're still unclear on why that didn't constitute an involuntary commitment. I guess it's a different legal process they were using for that evaluation. But, the goal in those situations is usually not to put somebody behind bars or try to permanently affect their life. Usually the goal is to try and help them and rehabilitate them. And so that's why you'll see people slip through the cracks like this. And it's much more infuriating in hindsight, knowing what they did,
right,
what they went on to do. But most people don't go on to do those sorts of things. And so it's hard. It's very hard to prevent these sort of things. We had a whole podcast a while back with Professor James Allen Fox, who tracks mass shootings for the Associated Press. And we talked through a lot of different proposals and their strengths and weaknesses. That's the reality of all these things, is there's strengths and weaknesses to all policy positions that you put out there for how to stop these sorts of events, which do remain statistically very rare, as much as they are. Obviously, any single incident is going to be too many. Nobody wants any of these to happen ever. The question is, how do you stop them? And that's where you get into a lot of trade-offs,
right?
Whether it's with the effectiveness of the policy or the burden on large swaths of people to try and prevent one person from doing something, or a tiny percentage of people from doing something. That's the issues you face here. But anyway, I've gotten us a little bit off track with that. I don't believe there's no bill that's floating around yet. All we've really heard as far as specifics of what Democrats want are basically an assault weapons ban. That's right. What in the story the specific policy that's been touched on by some of these Democrats.
Right. Particularly Illinois Democrats. And, you know, like we said, just the way that this all works out and the fact that in this shooting, like the last few shootings you rattled off, there were missed opportunities to use existing laws. I think this just all works in the favor of those that don't want to see more legislation. And I think we are unlikely to see a formal bill actually advanced.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's just, I mean, the Senate doesn't move that fast on this kind of stuff, especially when they just passed the reform. I think most of them would argue that they want to see how that plays out, and that they all understand it wouldn't stop every single mass shooting. The hope or their goal was to decrease the number and try to have some effect with a policy that doesn't go as far as in the restrictions, into restrictions as perhaps it could have. You know, this is a compromise. This is something where they had to find some common ground, even though they couldn't get a majority of Republicans to back it, but they did get 15, which is quite a lot in the Senate. It's actually, they only got 14 in the House, which is fascinating. But either way, it seems very unlikely that they're going to immediately go back to that well, even with another mass shooting occurring.
Yeah, I think that's right. But
and look, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. After you.
It's like we're stuck at a door.
Yeah.
You go first. No, I was just going to say, like, we're at, there've been 7 of these mass shootings this year, according to the Mother Jones tracker, which, is 3 or more dead with an element of randomness to the attack in public. So no gang-related shootings or other shootings of that nature. Yeah, a lot, actually, most mass shootings where somebody kills 3 or more people, unfortunately, are events where somebody murders their whole family in their own home. So it's obviously a different problem, but that doesn't get tracked in these in the Mother Jones counts. And it also does. Most of the media counts are 3 or more people shot, or 3 or 4, depends on which account you're looking at. But so that's obviously a much broader statistic that incorporates all sorts of different kinds of shootings. Most of them are gang-related shootings or crime-related in some way, drugs or gangs or what have you. But the Mother Jones one, I think, is a much better metric. It gets you down to what most people would probably consider a mass shooting in the average person's mind, which is something similar to Uvalde or Buffalo or this shooting in Illinois. And so there have been 7 of those this year, which really puts us back on track with what we've been seeing the pre-pandemic years, much higher than back in the 80s or 90s, but we're likely to see probably another 4 or 5 before the end of this year, unfortunately, if the averages keep. And it seems like we're getting back to what is unfortunately a normal pace for these events in recent in like the last decade or so, taking out there were only 2 in 2020, but I don't think our solution to mass shootings is going to be locking everyone down in their homes. So we have to find other ways of preventing these attacks. But it's one of those sad things that came back once the pandemic alleviated and people were gathering in crowds again, and you had we have not solved the issue clearly. But yes, you're likely to see renewed calls for new gun control after mass shootings going forward. I think you're unlikely to see another federal bill before the midterms.